This is Patreon exclusive material from Norse Code. Welcome to the Patreon portion of today's broadcast, where we are going to discuss with Arif Hasan how this show actually happened and kind of where did you come from, Arif? I'm not asking for, visuals. I'm just, where the hell are you from?
Wow. We got a nickel for every time I heard that question.
I'm not meaning it in a racist way. Let me be clear.
I'm from America, James.
Is that it?
Is there anything else you wanted to know?
You're clearly
no.
Where's your passport? I'm not buying this. I'm not buying this crap at all. Wow, I'm sounding about as racist as Dusty on some of those old episodes. talking about the Germans and everything. Actually,
yeah. Well,
Dusty's the one with the noted history of hating the Irish, but that's a whole nother thing.
That's a whole nother Patreon exclusive, right? We'll have to get him back on just for that, because he is alive.
He is alive. He's complaining about the fact that his restaurant is closed at the moment over in Denver because no one is allowed to be leaving their homes without their guitar. Without their electric guitar solos and gasoline, flamethrowers and everything. So
right, yeah. So I started out actually at the very site that hosts this podcast, the Daily Norseman. Kind of funny, actually. I was not super into football. I've told this story a couple of times, but I was not into football in high school at all. Did not enjoy it. I was a nerd, and I was like, football is for. I didn't really think it was like for dumb jocks. It was just like not for me. Like my best friend was the starting center on the football team.
Did you just side note, because I know you were in Grand Forks for a period of time there. Where did you end up going to high school at? Was it in Grand Forks?
I did not end up going to high school in Grand Forks. Okay. I moved to Minnesota in 6th grade. So
that's right.
I ended up going to high school at Bloomington Jefferson. Peter Jacobson, who I think is still a patron. So shout out Peter Jacobson, was like the starting center for our high school team. So I didn't like hate football, but like he'd be the first to tell you it was like clearly not for me. Right. I'm sure I made fun of him for playing football too. But I was like not into it. And in high school, in order to be on the college debate team, they like required you to play their fantasy football league. And I was like, no, absolutely not. I don't know anything about football. I would not be useful in a league. And they're like, all the more reason you should join, because they want to win, right? Like I hadn't even processed that part of it.
They just want bodies.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so they'd signed me up and they were like, well, if you don't want to play, you don't have to play. You'll be auto drafting. And, I wasn't an idiot. I figured out, what that would mean just from the context. But I decided that, I should say I was less of an idiot then. But I decided, like, if my name's attached to it, I absolutely want to. I can't lose. There's no way. And so I did a ton of research in, like, what helps you win in fantasy football. I didn't really know where to begin. But I did a ton of because, like, I was a debater. We do research, right? That's, like, our thing. And so I did a ton of research. My second year in the league, I ended up winning it. I want to say it's because of my skill. It's also because I picked up Michael Vick right away. I fell in love with it. It's super fun to watch. If you get introduced from a fantasy perspective, you get kind of a broad view. And mind you, if you figured out the years, Michael Vick blew up in 2010. That means I first joined this fantasy football league in 2009 when the Vikings were a fairly interesting team.
That was a good time to be a Vikings fan.
Yeah. For most of the year.
The January after, questionable for like a week, but there was a great...
it did re-inculcate me into the Vikings experience, right?
Yes.
Because when I was in Grand Forks, I did enjoy football. I wasn't into it because I was a child, but I did enjoy football. And then I watched like the 1998 game. I was like, all right, well, I don't need to worry about this.
I remember sitting with my parents as that championship game was happening, and I was in Players. I was in this pizza restaurant that existed in Grand Forks shortly before the owner burned it to the ground. He didn't burn it to the ground. He just burned every other restaurant he owned to the ground. There was some other story as to why Players closed, but I remember sitting with my parents watching that game while there was some like pizza thing, like people were like walking around with pizza and they would just bring it down to your plate as opposed to going up to a pizza buffet. It was like odd. But I remember looking up the screen every couple seconds, like, wow, that score just keeps getting bigger for the Giants, doesn't it? Like, oh.
Yeah, it just keeps going, huh?
Yeah.
They don't stop it? No? All right.
There's no mercy rule in the NFL, as it turned out.
But yeah, getting into fantasy football while the local team is having like one of the most amazing years. Like I watched the Greg Lewis game, the Favre to Greg Lewis 49ers game with the rest of the debate team, and I got like chills, right? It was incredible. So it was easy to get hooked on it. And around, it was 2010. So after that year, I kind of was figuring out that like most football articles I was reading were like really bad. Like they were just bad at making good arguments. Which of course is the first way I evaluate, what I read. Like, is it making a good argument? But like the thing that really struck out to me was this argument that Cam Newton would be a remarkable quarterback in the NFL because he was a winner. And I was like, there's no way it's that easy. Like you can't just pick the quarterback who wins in college and he's like the better quarterback in the NFL.
It's that the Tebow argument.
Right. Yeah, right. A thing that I would become intimately familiar with literally a year later. But yeah, I was like, it cannot be that simple because there's so much ink spilled, I guess both digitally and in print at the time, about how to select a quarterback and who to pick and whether or not Cam Newton's a good pick, that it can't be this simple. And so the first thing I ever wrote for the Daily Norseman was a fan post that this argument was just not good. I did not have an opinion on whether or not Cam Newton would be a good or a bad quarterback in the NFL, but this is just like not a good argument. And, it did all right. But I kept writing because it was like an outlet to talk about all the stuff I hated to read and hear. And so, that kind of spiraled. And then I ended up writing something about the stadium debate. And I was like, okay, we're talking about economics. We're talking about subsidies. We're in my wheelhouse. I have access to all this research about this kind of stuff. So I wrote like this huge thing. And then I also wrote like a legislator mock draft. And that actually got way more views than the economics thing that I wrote. But, that kind of blew up. And then like Ted and Chris over the Daily Norseman kind of were like, hey, we've been noticing that you've been writing a lot of stuff. Well, you should write for our front page. And I was like, cool. Does that pay? And they're like, absolutely not.
So you're like, I'll do it anyway.
Yeah. All right. I'm on board. So I did that and I'd started my political career, which was like 80 hours a week. And I'd kept finding random time, to write and read about football during my 80-hour-a-week awful job where I was trying to get Amy Klobuchar to sign on to not build a bridge over the St. Croix River. Fail, by the way, did not win that campaign. It's a contrast between what I thought I loved, which is politics and direct action and all that, between something I actually loved. And so I was like, this sucks. So I applied to the Bleacher Report. And they took me in right away, and you had to apply at the time. You had to submit a writing sample. It was actually not that difficult, but it was more difficult than it was kind of before when Bleacher Report was an SEO-based click farm, the 40 hottest wives and girlfriends. I definitely remember that period of time for Bleacher Report. Bleacher Report not Clickhole, but because that's the Onion version of it. Right.
Yeah, just. Ugh.
Yeah, it did crazy good numbers, but it was awful. But by that time had cordoned off that section, and now they've gotten rid of it entirely. But they had cordoned off that section, and they're like, no, we're taking a serious turn. We want to hire good quality talent. So that's kind of how I got my start. Bleacher Report started paying me after I had done well enough, and so that's when I was like, maybe I could make this a career. Quit my political job, built up enough equity to go in on a home. And so that allowed me basically, charge my friend's rent to cover the mortgage. And that allowed me basically to pursue football writing without having to worry about like paying rent. And so I did that for a long time. And, I did Vikings Territory and a website called Vikings Journal and Cover 32. There's like a ton of different sites I'm writing for. Like the original intro to this podcast was like, and he writes for like 8 million blogs.
Because at the time that was incredibly accurate.
Yeah. I've written for a number of websites that are now defunct. The International Business Times would just like pay you to write random stuff. So I did that too, about football. It was very weird. But I go to my brother's wedding, in Vermont, and Dusty's really good friends with my brother, or he was, and I don't know if they've had a falling out or something.
No, they still are, but
okay.
I can,
Wow.
I can start with where everything else ends up meeting here. So I ended up living in the cities for a few years for college. And at the time, I wasn't a huge Vikings fan. I watched football every once in a while, and I made it to a couple of games before I became a big fan. I ended up at, I think my first actual Vikings fan, or my first actual Vikings game was a Monday night game with, against Tom Brady and the Patriots. Which,
oh boy,
it was a decent game, and the Vikings were blown out, as would be expected. But it was something to do, and I was actually much more of a basketball fan, and because at the time that I was living in the cities, the Timberwolves were so terrible, the parking at First Ave was often more expensive than the tickets across the street over at the Target Center. So I'd spend much more time. I'd spend much more time playing. I'd spend much more time watching basketball than I would be football. But I had a good friend who was a big Vikings fan, or he was a big Cowboys fan, but he watched the Vikings, and I'd go over there often, and we'd drink pretty heavy. We'd eat a bunch of food, and I remember watching the Vikings game where Adrian Peterson broke the record as a rookie against the Chargers. And for whatever reason, like that moment was where it really started for me. I was like, wow, I really, really like this stuff. And then as that progressed into, the 2009 season, which was also a big thing for me, my brother and I would get ridiculously cheap tickets on StubHub, and we went to nearly every game in the same section every year, or every game for the for that campaign. I didn't make it to the Cowboys home game, and I didn't make it to the Ravens game. But other than that, I was there the whole time, and it was great, and it was so fun to watch. And my dislike of Favre was I like knowing that the clock was going to strike 12 on that, and just knowing the moment before he threw that interception in the championship game, like just knowing that this was coming, and it hurt so bad. It was like, you know how this story ends. This is a monkey's paw. This is a monkey's paw of a season right here. You're gonna do so well. It's gonna be Favre's best year statistically. Also, he is going to crush your soul, and he did. And proceeded to watch the Vikings pretty religiously after that. It wasn't until I graduated from recording school and had to move back home, back to Grand Forks in the very beginning of 2010, because my mom got really, really sick. I came back, and I was looking for something to do to keep my recording chops up, because quite frankly, there just wasn't any recording work to do in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I knew some musicians, and it was fun to work with them, but I didn't know. I needed something to do. And Dusty, one night, drunkenly, I believe, I don't have evidence, but I have reason to believe, Dusty one night was talking to me online. Was like, "Hey, we should do a show. We should do a politics show." I was like, "I don't want to do a politics show." He's like, "Politics and music," and I went right on. And we did this because I was real into the current, and what I really wanted to do was either be a recording engineer or I wanted to be a station manager somewhere because I really liked indie music, and I would make mixtapes for people or mix CDs for people, and people really liked them. So it's like, hey, this is a way to do it. So Dusty and I proceeded to do 2 shows over the course of the next 2 years that are terrible, and I do not suggest anyone go out and listen to. There's a lot of Dusty rants of varying sobriety. There's me with like 30 seconds of opinion, and then some amazing music. And I was just reminded the other day, and Dusty, I would say this if Dusty was on the call, we were both in agreement that the 2 shows that we did, the Untitled 1 show and the States' Rights Minute, which was neither about states' rights nor a minute, which was part of the intro, were any good. The soundtrack, however, stands the test of time as this great thing that we did. So the Spotify playlist is out there for the entirety. It's like 17 hours worth of music, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But it's like the only really positive thing that came out of it, other than it was able to put us into a position where we were able to do shows. And so like we got like the base of it down. And at the middle of 2012, we had to stop recording because I was about to have a kid, and I wasn't sure about the amount of time I was going to end up having with recording and all of that. So the next year in 2013, right around the summer, Dusty and I hadn't done a show for 6-8 months. I still had all my recording equipment. I was not using it for work as I was working at UND, but Dusty proceeds to text me from a wedding that he was attending and happened to run into Arif, and I'll hand this over to you.
Yeah. So Dusty is like, hey, you do really great work writing about the Vikings. Do you have a podcast? And I was like, no, I've been thinking about starting one, but I can't really, like host a show or anything like that. I don't think that's in my skill set. And he's like, well, you remember James? And I was like, no, he lived right behind you. Oh, Victor's brother.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, yeah, he tried teaching me how to skateboard once. I ate it.
That does sound like something I would do, because I also was terrible at skating, so I can't imagine me teaching anyone would be even better.
Well, also, you had like the steepest driveway in the neighborhood. It was not useful.
Accurate. Teaching my son to ride his bike down it the first time was hilarious. Just, oh my gosh! Just the look of terror in his eyes.
Yeah, and he's like, well, yeah, we do a podcast. Don't listen to it, which is like a really great pitch. Like, hey, we do this podcast. It's awful. I want you to do a podcast with us.
Just know that we have the foundation there. If you go inside the building, everything's crap. But just know that the building itself is sturdy.
Right. It was like I was like, this is a really incredible. But I bought in right away because I had already been thinking about doing a podcast, and genuinely, Dusty's pitch was actually really good. And he was talking about, hey, the biggest problem with most podcasts is they're going to blow up, and there's not that many Vikings podcasts on the market, which unbelievably was true at the time. Like we went through Apple's podcasts that showed up when you typed in the word Vikings, and it was like abysmal.
Yeah.
I don't want to like name names or anything like that, but it was not a great environment, both in terms of like depth. Like I don't think any of the podcasts were in depth, or in terms of breadth. There were not that many podcasts. And
sound quality was something that had been pitched to me.
Right. And that's actually one of the first things Dusty brought up is like, one thing that's going to separate you from what's going to be an explosion of Vikings podcasts is that we've got great sound quality. We're going to have a sound producer, James, and we know how to record, and we'll set you up with a recording environment, which actually it turns out was not like true for the first like 8 episodes. We'll set you up with a recording environment that is going to increase our audio quality, which honestly, like I had this awful mic at the beginning. And it was still better than most podcasts would have with an awful mic. So it's not as if like we'd screwed it up from the beginning. We just needed to continue working to stay ahead of the curve. But yeah, that was like a big pitch. And I was like, well, if this is like all great off the ground, like fantastic. And I was like, what's the setup? Like, what's it going to cost? How much do I have to like pay in? Because I don't like have money. I write for a living. And Dusty's like, yeah, we'll cover the back end and we'll ask people to cover for the show and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, great.
Yeah, he pitched it to me in the idea that we could do this show, and it could help Arif's exposure as a writer. And that if he mentioned you, and of course I know who that is. That's an incredibly unique name. I know exactly who I know exactly who that would have been. And he said that, James, I know you don't have a lot of time to be recording right now. You have this, you have this 6-month-old son. So all you're going to have to do is just edit the show. You don't have to be talent. You don't have to be on air. And every time I say this, or every time I've told this story, Arif laughs for good reason. You don't have to be.
He wasn't lying at the time.
At the time, no. A couple weeks later, he would have been. But he said to me, you don't have to be on air talent. You can just edit and be fine. And I went, great. I can work this into my schedule. I don't have any sort of problem with this. Let's do it. Let's get stuff rolling. And the first couple episodes were incredibly long and miserable to edit. And then in true Dusty form, his computer just died. And not in the way that it can be like recovered quickly. Just the whole thing was a series of errors. And Dusty is really good technically with computers and rebuilding everything. And everything he did just made it worse. But now we had a show, and it was on the Daily Norseman, and we had, what's the reason that you and I say that we keep doing these shows? It's not reliability. It's not responsibility. It's obligation. We had an obligation.
Yes, that was it. That was like one of our first taglines. Yeah.
Exactly. We have an obligation now to do the show. So he said, James, could you cover for me? like you would if you were covering somebody's shift at work.
Yeah.
I was like, sure, I'll give it a shot. And those first few episodes with Arif and I did in fact sound like we had the chemistry of two people who hadn't talked in 20 years. As it turned out, that was totally legit. That's exactly what happened. And we kind of fell into a groove for a little bit, and then Dusty was able to return like 4, 6, 8 weeks later. Whatever it was. And the joke was that his laptop had gone rogue and was like a part of the destabilizing effort in Syria and all these things. So
the laptop being a fugitive ended up becoming a running joke as he continued to have problems with that laptop.
He was so pissed by the end of that. And we'd have 3-man pods, and he'd come on and everything. And then I would come on for occasional special stuff. But and then it was you two for a pretty long time. And Dusty's situation. So Dusty, the person who's not able to tell his story at the moment, because he's not on the call right now. Dusty was my best friend, and I suppose he still is, from Grand Forks. All three of us at one point existed in the same place at the same time in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And he moved out to Denver and was heavily involved in the restaurant business. And he would just kind of have really weird hours. So I would get recordings in from the two of them at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, which at the time you weren't sleeping anyway. So it didn't really matter, I guess, but I was getting really, really late calls, in for recordings and stuff. And he went out there. He was involved in restaurant stuff, but eventually things got to the point where his schedule would be too busy for him to do the 2 shows during the regular season. And so we would split it, and I would do the preview show, and Dusty would do I would do the recap show, and he would do the preview. And then it slowly became a thing where I was just doing all of the hosting, which turned out to be fine eventually. And Dusty ended up kind of leaving the show formally after the Eagles 38-7 game.
Yeah.
And we brought him back briefly last season for a couple of different reasons to see if that would end up working, if his level of interest was still there and everything. And his work ended up kind of consuming him. And there were a whole mess of other things happening in his life that ended up kind of taking over. So I told people that they were going to prefer Dusty over me after he was a bit like a new puppy. He just needed to kind of get back. He needed to kind of learn everything kind of around him, his surroundings, everything. But he didn't really get a chance to do that. He ended up having to leave. So, Dusty's been off the show for a little while, but he is still the one of the godfathers of the show, and was able to convince both of us that we should do this show with him. And then he managed to disappear.
They bounced.
Yeah.
Incredible work.
It's
love the hustle.
And so there's also been a question of the Loch Ness Monster. Why the Loch Ness Monster is so important to the people of Norse code. And the Loch Ness Monster thing is obviously
so removed from that episode. I can't believe that.
What was that?
It's just like it just feels like this is like when we made the reference at the time, everyone immediately understood it.
Oh yeah.
And now people are like, yeah, what does that mean? I'm like, oh, am I old? I'm old.
Yeah. Old. Listen. Right before I laid down for the show, I was literally in traction. I am old. I am. I was at physical therapy, having my spine separated so that I would be in less pain. I am old. But so the Loch Ness Monster thing is a reference to the episode of South Park where Chef gets married to a succubus, which is just a fun sentence to say. And his parents continue to see the Loch Ness Monster everywhere, and it keeps asking them for Tree Fitty. And which Matt and Trey Parker have said was one of the most ridiculous things they ever did. And then they just proceeded to do it to death during that episode, and they loved it. And so Dusty and I would make pleas for money on our two previous shows, and we would say, you could send Tree Fitty to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. And I can't remember if it was after our horrific attempt at selling ads on Norse code or if it was before it, but I remember using it.
I think it was before it. I remember going through, this is back when like the very first DFS, this is before FanDuel and DraftKings.
Mm-hmm.
The very first like DFS companies that popped up, like Draft Street or something was its name. It ended up getting bought, I think, by DraftKings. And Dusty was giving like baseball DFS advice. We had an Audible. Everyone had an Audible referral code.
We made like exactly $2 off of that, by the way, in case you're curious.
Yeah.
I found this receipt on that.
Incredible. Well, you got to file it for tax purposes.
Yes.
Yeah. We were still asking for Patreon money, I think, over the course of us having ads on the show.
It was PayPal at the time, and then it turned into Patreon afterwards.
Yeah.
So we did this. I had done this thing where we were asking. I think just as a throwaway line, had mentioned, Tree Fitty to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, and people started to, started to send in, and it just became the legacy of the show at that point. And so my favorite thing about this whole experience has been that the Tree Fitty not only is the base level for the Patreon, but we had a listener go to Loch Ness, purchase from the gift shop, I believe it was from the gift shop there, a little Nessie doll, and proceeded to take pictures of it leaving Loch Ness, and then having all its trips around the UK, and then giving it to you guys formally over at the taping, or over at the actual at the Vikings London game. And he's kind of become a bit of a symbol for the away stuff that we end up doing. And so Nessie ends up making an appearance. Nessie made the appearance didn't make the appearance at the New York taping, did go to the Jets game, and then did make it to both the Seahawks game and the Seattle taping, and people were happy to see that. So, and I ran into a couple of listeners, including Brad, BC dad, who was like, wow, that's the actual Nessie there. That's kind of cool. So, but the fact that we ended up getting a gift from a fan that actually had been to Loch Ness. My kid occasionally likes to steal that and sleep with it, so it just kind of makes me laugh whenever I end up seeing it there. But
That's amazing.
Dylan, where did you put Nessie? Oh, he's over here. Okay. But yeah, so the Loch Ness Monster thing has just always been a thing for the show like that. So that's about it for that. I'm trying to think if there's any other like inside baseball stuff that we have on the show, other than, you know, my stepson being a cannibal. If you're new to the show, there was a show last year where my oldest stepson made some comment in his sleep that was loud enough where everyone else was able to hear. He's like, I don't want to eat anybody again, or I don't want to eat anybody anymore, or something like that. And so I mentioned it on the show because it's hilarious. And from that point on, the joke became that James has a cannibal son and his wife, who works at a funeral home, is trying to smuggle in human flesh for him. So it just became this thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a couple of things. Obviously, there's like the thing. I hate turkey. That's obviously like a thing that pops up. I
Always
hate Carson Wentz. It's a thing.
The Arif as Seattle fan will never die, and it seems to be brought up. Just hell, I did it earlier in the show. Actually, early in the pre-show.
Yeah, in the pre-show. Yeah, I didn't even realize that would come back to bite me too. Yeah. My ardent defense of homemade candy corn.
That was a thing. I hate candy corn. Arif hates plastic candy corn.
Yeah, I hate this. This is going to sound insanely hipster. I hate corporate candy corn. If you just get locally sourced or homemade candy corn, you'd realize how good it actually is. No,
locally sourced candy corn is about the most hipster thing you can say.
Yeah.
Really.
I don't think there is locally sourced. Well, there probably is, but I've never had locally sourced candy corn. I just felt the need to say it as I continued my rant. But
yes.
But yeah, I mean, those are things. What was I going to say? Vince Young's Heisman Trophy is a thing.
Oh, the Vince. Yeah,
we dropped that the past couple of years, but that's
the Vince Young traveling Heisman Trophy is one of the original things that Dusty and Arif went off on, and the problem is that episode's audio quality is so crap that it's really hard to listen to. But I did put it on one of the original Christmas episodes of like. It was you two were pitching the idea of
a sitcom of Reggie Bush and Vince Young living together,
yes,
and having dueling Heisman trophies set up in the living room.
Exactly. So, it's a thing. A lot of the kind of. I've told people before that if you really want to know about the dynamic of the show or kind of the history of the show, the best thing to do is listen to the Christmas episodes, because there's not a ton of football stuff on there, but there is a ton of behind the scenes, I say we hate Dusty, or, waiting for Dusty to be on calls, or Dusty and I talking about the history of what was it? Dusty and I talking about the history of trying animals for human crimes is in there. So. And then Arif joins the call, and Arif's like, "Oh yeah, I totally knew all of that." I'm like, "What the
hell?" The horse herpes thing, that was a pre-show.
Oh yes,
a conversation between you and Dusty.
Oh, the horse herpes thing was a callback to the only funny thing we ever did on the Untitled One show. And I have that on a SoundCloud thing somewhere. I was doing deadpan of a news read about the horse herpes outbreak in Utah, and Dusty was dying laughing the entire time. I was doing nothing but...
Oh, why? Is that a really funny story to tell?
Oh, my God.
So good.
I was doing a Stephen Colbert just straightforward read of things. I wasn't even trying to make it funny, and he was just dying at this. So I think we beat the Daily Show by like 2 days on it, but it didn't matter because nobody listened to the show. The term we were using was podcaster baiting, and it was nobody was able to hear. Nobody we were the best kept secret in all of whatever, but that clip ended up going around to people, and people who heard it really liked it. So, but I maintain it's one of the only funny things we ever did for the Untitled One show. But yeah, it's like Dusty and I's discussion on horse herpes was, God, I almost forgot about that on the show.
We had a Panthers guest, Scott, I forget his last name. Sorry, Scott. And we ended up talking about the racist board game Public Assistance.
Public Assistance, the board game, which I brought to Seattle and I forgot to break out. We totally could have done that the Sunday night that we ended up in a dive bar in Capitol Hill, which was totally my fault. It's like I thought the pictures were just dark. Like I thought they just didn't use flash. No, it turned out the bar was dark. Totally could have played Public Assistance that night instead of half drunkenly riding bikes over to Dick's for food. And me
that
later.
Bad,
oh, that was great. And then I rode my bike down to the Jimi Hendrix statue after that. So, like, sure, why not? Yeah, the racist board game the racist board game thing was just fantastic. God, Public Assistance, the board game. Why work for a living? That's something liberals would own, right?
Yeah. No, we have to. We have to hear every side. You have to get the Public Assistance board game.
I want to mail that to you so you and Chelsea can play that for during your downtime. I just want to see her scrub all the pieces down for like quarantine purposes.
Yeah, I don't know if that board game is worth that much effort.
Yeah,
I think we would receive it, and she's like, honestly, things can only live on surfaces for like 4 days max, so we'll just put it in this corner and hope that you forget about it, Arif. Oh, okay.
Arif, why do you have an ever-increasing selection of racist board games? That's the sentence I want to hear. All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this little behind the scenes kind of where things started with the show. We will eventually have more content for Patreon stuff. The next episode will probably not be for a couple of weeks, but or even after the next episode that we end up putting out. So, but just wanted to give you guys something else for the Patreon people. So again, thank you guys so much. You are the reason we are able to do this show ad free. You are the reason that we have our overhead paid for doing shows like this, or for doing shows that we post on the Daily Norseman and everywhere else. We are able to be ad free. We are able to be in a situation where if one of us ends up not having a microphone for whatever reason during a travel, we're able to quickly ship that off. Or if my recording software fob breaks, we can quickly replace that and not miss much of a show in order to do it. It's things like that people don't think about when it comes to doing a podcast. And because of the money you guys send to us, we are able to be in such a good position to be able to handle the emergency stuff, to be able to handle the bills, to be able to, look at a thing like, okay, well, the domain thing is coming up and that's going to be $100 or whatever. We need to be able to do that. So again, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. And we hope to be providing you with much more Patreon content coming up here with the summer and the regular season, but or whatever is happening in the fall. I don't. The fall is going to be weird as far as sports goes, so we'll see how all that goes. But again, thank you guys so much, and we will now return to, if you're listening to this during the full edit of the show, we will now be returning to your regularly scheduled broadcast of this episode of Norse Code. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hasan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hasan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pogatshnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.